This video is about the history of interpersonal theory, which I'm going to describe by talking about some of the major figures who made contributions to interpersonal theory over the years. And you have to start with Harry Stack Sullivan, who's the father of interpersonal theory. Harry Stack Sullivan became famous in psychiatric circles in the early part of the 20th century, and his work were culminated in a couple of books like The Interpersonal Theory of Psychiatry and The Psychiatric Interview, which laid the foundations for interpersonal theory as we understand it today. He had a couple of quotes that are sort of famous in representing his views about personality and psychopathology and human nature. The first is, we're all much more simply human than otherwise. So he tried to reduce the hierarchical nature of psychiatry and tried to understand the interpersonal maneuvers between he and his patients as a human exchange. Second, personality is the relatively enduring pattern of interpersonal situations that characterize our life. This is really the essence of interpersonal theory, the idea that personality is not something located within a person. Personality is about the process of relations that we have with other people. Timothy Leary and his colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley and Kaiser Permanente built on Sullivan's ideas by trying to operationalize his concepts into a measurement model. So they used data from psychometric measures like the MMPI, as well as their observations of group psychotherapy to try to capture the full spectrum in a comprehensive map of interpersonal theory, which led to the interpersonal circle that you can see here and which we continue to use to this day. Now, Leary also focused on how different kinds of data can provide different kinds of information about interpersonal functioning. So observing what people are like in their life is different than asking them to report on what they're like in a questionnaire, is different than listening to the stories that they tell about their own interpersonal relations. So in his circle, as you can see, there are different levels of interpersonal function that go from the center to the outside to represent these different kinds of data sources. And his idea was that the overall patterning of these levels across different sources of information is really informative for understanding a person and their interpersonal patterns. And that also is an idea that we continue to use in interpersonal research today. Bob Carson wrote a book in 1969 called Interaction Concepts of Personality, in which he formulated the concept of complementarity, one of the most important constructs that we have in interpersonal theory. Complementarity says that if you're dominant, I'll tend to be submissive and vice versa, and if you're warm, I'll tend to be warm and vice versa. Of course, we've done a lot of research and there's a lot of evidence supporting the idea of complementarity both across and within interpersonal situations. And it's really one of the foundational concepts in contemporary interpersonal research. Don Kiesler extended these ideas to try to understand what was happening during these interactions, what gave rise to complementary patterns, and particularly, what does this matter for things like psychotherapy? So in his idea, people make an impact, interpersonal gestures make an impact on other people. So when I do something to you, it causes you to experience something. Part of your experience is, of course, based on an objective evaluation of whatever I've done, but you also perceive me in certain ways based on your goals or based on the way I behaved, etc. And so the combination of those different factors produce a covert impact, what you experience me doing, and based on your own perception of what I've done, you will then behave in response to me in a way that's typically complementary, but can importantly deviate from complementarity in important ways. So he really added the idea of goals and perceptions as factors that influence complementary patterns. He also developed a couple of measurement instruments to study these things, the impact message inventory being the most important. And he would study psychotherapy sessions by rating them according to the kinds of messages that occurred during those sessions. He also wrote a book that was really, or edited a book, wrote a book, sorry, that was really important for me in my graduate training, which summarized interpersonal research up until the 90s when it was published. Jerry Wiggins was a tremendously important figure in interpersonal theory, as well as trait theory and psychometrics and psychological assessment in general. Jerry is one of the many people following the Leary and Kaiser work who tried to work out the psychometric details of interpersonal assessment measures, culminating in the interpersonal adjective scales, a measure of interpersonal traits. He was also one of the people that helped turn the inventory of interpersonal problems into a circular measure. He did lots more than that. He wrote one of the most important books on psychological assessment and psychometrics. And he wrote a book towards the end of his career in which he compared different paradigms of personality assessment by having experts in each paradigm all assess the same person and then put those assessments together to show how different personality assessment paradigms capture different aspects of people. Jerry was a pretty integrative thinker, as demonstrated by that last project, and it's in part because of Jerry's spirit that interpersonal theory is an integrative one that doesn't compete with other perspectives, but rather tries to incorporate them. Lorna Smith Benjamin was another giant in the field of interpersonal theory. She is probably most well known for her developing the SASB model or the structural analysis of social behavior. In the SASB model, the main distinction is that complementarity doesn't work the same all the time. It depends on who is making the bid and who's receiving the bid, what she calls the transitive and intransitive surfaces. And the point that she makes, and the reason that she says this is important, is because the opposite, or excuse me, the anti-complement of dominance is not dominance. So normally we think that anti-complementarity would be dominant response to dominant behavior. But her point is the complement of dominance would be to submit. If someone tells you something to do something, then you will do it. That's a complementary response. But the opposite or the anti-complement would not be to tell them what to do instead. The anti-complement would be to say, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to do my own thing, which is to emancipate or take autonomy. So in her model, there's three different surfaces: the transitive surfaces to either try to control somebody or to try to grant them autonomy. The intransitive is to accept control or to take autonomy. And a third surface has to do with how you treat yourself. Do you emancipate yourself? Do you give yourself freedom to behave, or do you try to control yourself? Lorna Smith Benjamin also developed a psychotherapy model, particularly designed for people who hadn't done well in previous psychotherapies, people who typically have diagnoses of personality disorder, that she called interpersonal reconstructive therapy. She wrote a number of important books, one about personality disorder diagnosis using the interpersonal model, and two about her approach to psychotherapy. Len Horowitz made the very important point that the heart of interpersonal theory is really motives. That is, the reason that we behave in the ways that we do is because we're trying to accomplish something. This is a core premise in his book, Interpersonal Foundations of Psychopathology, in which he reconfigures or reconstrues mental health problems as difficulties or failures to achieve interpersonal goals. Lynn was also the author of the first version of the Inventory of Interpersonal Problems, which was originally designed to be a tool to assess psychotherapy outcomes across theoretical orientations. And what he observed in his research was that the main thing people describe when they present for psychotherapy is either things that they feel like they do too much in relation to others or things that they don't do enough in relation to others. And it's those concepts that form the items of the Inventory of Interpersonal Problems. Debbie Moskowitz was a pioneer in ambulatory assessment, or the idea of assessing people multiple times per day in their daily lives. Of course, is a very common method to use today, but when Debbie started doing it, she was one of the very first, and she organized her assessments around the interpersonal circumplex. Debbie developed three important constructs or new constructs that she added to the interpersonal lexicon: flux, pulse, and spin. And these concepts describe variability across interactions as people go through their daily lives. So, for example, pulse has to do with the variability in intensity. Are you sort of the same level of warmth all the time, or do you vacillate from being kind of distant to extremely warm from one interaction to the next? Spin has to do with variability around the circle. So are you mostly warm most of the time, or are you sometimes warm, sometimes cold, sometimes dominant, sometimes submissive? She and her students did a host of studies showing how these and other dynamic concepts within interpersonal psychology are related to things like mental health, situational context, etc. Michael Gertman was another one of the people that really worked on the psychometric issues associated with interpersonal assessment. He did a number of studies showing how you could use interpersonal constructs as a kind of map for understanding other constructs in psychology, in keeping with the sort of Wiggins style integrated spirit of interpersonal theory. And maybe one of his most important contributions was developing the structural summary method of interpersonal profiles. So I've got another video about that you can check out. But basically, the structural summary approach uses the geometry of the circle to take 8 octant scores from an interpersonal circumplex measure and turn them into 4 parameters that have psychological meaning and thus can make a more efficient and useful way to interpret interpersonal profiles. Steve Strack was involved sort of in some ways behind the scenes in interpersonal theory. He edited a couple of important books in interpersonal theory, one with Maury Lohr and one with Len Horowitz, sort of described, sort of surveyed interpersonal research at the time. He was also really an important player in the Society for Interpersonal Theory and Research, and he was the sort of brains behind the operation for really the first 20 or so years of that organization's life. So he was a really important figure in helping promote interpersonal theory. Pamela Sadler has done work on complementarity, and perhaps her most important contribution was developing the continuous assessment of interpersonal dynamics, or the CADE method for coding interpersonal behavior. Whereas Debbie and others focused on how variation occurs across interactions, CADE captures how variation occurs while an interaction is happening. So in CADE, coders observe an interaction and they code what each person is doing in the interaction on warmth and dominance continuously so that you get a data point every half second. And it produces these rich time series with which you can study things like complementarity and lots of other stuff. Many people are now using CADE to study interpersonal processes, so this was a really major contribution for interpersonal theory. Ken Locke also made important contributions to measurement and other areas of interpersonal theory. For example, he developed the circumplex scales of interpersonal efficacies with Pam, also the circumplex scales of interpersonal values. He's also done a number of important studies on culture and how interpersonal dispositions vary at the level of culture and across cultures. In addition to a number of other important papers in the area of interpersonal research. Tim Smith took interpersonal theory in a slightly different direction. He studies how interpersonal processes, often in couples, are related to health, often cardiac health. And his work really documents the importance of interpersonal relationships for things like heart disease and other important health outcomes. Finally, the guru, the bodhisattva, the rabbi of contemporary interpersonal theory, Aaron Pincus. Aaron Pincus is the reason that I got into interpersonal theory when I was a graduate student, trying to figure out how to integrate my research and my practice, trying to figure out how to respond to patients when they said something and I didn't know what to do. I read a chapter by him and a light bulb really turned on, and I've been really lucky to have worked with him since this time. In that chapter, he documents the major assumptions of interpersonal theory, which he's elaborated somewhat over the years. He's written a number of important texts, developed measures, made all kinds of contributions to interpersonal theory, has a number of students who've also done the same, but since they're my age, I'm not going to talk about them here. Some of them are even younger than me, which is not hard to do these days. One thing that Aaron and I did together was, along with Aidan Wright, is develop the interpersonal situation model that you can see here, which helps isolate the different features of the interpersonal situation and connect them to measurement tools. Of course, all of the people I've talked about today have done lots more than the things I described, and there's many other people who've made major contributions to interpersonal theory that I didn't describe, but I hope I've been able to kind of walk you through the history of interpersonal theory by focusing on some of its major contributors. Until next time, bye.